The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flicker of a neon sign outside the window. I was pressed against the cold bare wall, his hands moving over my body with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Daniel's breath was hot against my neck as he murmured words I couldn't quite decipher, his voice low and raw. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, as though closing the small distance between us could make sense of the chaos swirling around us. We moved together like two people trying to drown out the world. Each touch, each kiss, an attempt to escape something unspoken. His grip on my waist was firm, his movements commanding, and I surrendered completely, letting him lead me into the storm of his emotions. The mattress beneath us was unmade, the sheets tangled, but none of it mattered. In that moment, I wasn't thinking of anything. My fiancé, my future, or the life I was supposed to believe in. There was only Daniel and the heat between us, consuming everything in its path. Daniel's hands were everywhere, rough yet irreverent, as if he were trying to claim every part of me at once. His lips trailed along my collarbone, leaving a searing heat in your wake, and I gasped as he pulled me closer, his body pressing into mine with unrelenting intensity. The world outside dissolved into a haze of neon light and shadows, the sound of the city muffled by the frantic rhythm of our breathing. His touch was demanding, as though he was trying to hold on to something slipping away, and I responded with equal fervor, matching his urgency. He guided me back onto the mattress, his hands firm on my hips as he moved with a controlled strength that made my heart race. My fingers traced the contours of his shoulders, gripping tightly as though I might fall if I let go. The sheets beneath us twisted and tangled, but neither of us noticed. His whisper in my ear, raw and almost pleading, sent shivers down my spine, each word sinking into my skin and leaving its mark. There was no gentleness now, only raw, unfiltered need, and I surrendered to it completely. We ended in loud moans, and then lay in the dim light, our bodies slick with sweat and our breathing uneven. Daniel's arm draped over my waist, his fingers lightly tracing patterns along my skin, as though trying to memorize me. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. Yet, I felt no regret. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the past or the future, only the present, and the man beside me who made me forget everything else. I wondered what I had just become a part of. I knew almost nothing about him, this man who had appeared in my life so suddenly and so completely. But I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I met Daniel in an empty apartment on the edge of the city. I had been wandering aimlessly, trying to distract myself from the suffocating reality of planning a wedding with a man I wasn't sure I loved. The apartment had been listed for rent, but it felt more like a sanctuary, quiet, hidden, and detached from the world outside. And that's where he was, standing in the middle of the room as though he had been waiting for me. He was older, rugged, and carried a sadness I couldn't quite place. We didn't exchange pleasantries, barely even introduced ourselves. He simply asked me to stay, his tone more a command than a request, and I didn't say no. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew me in despite the warning bells in my head. We began meeting there regularly, always in the same empty apartment. He set the rules: no questions, no past, no futures. It was just us in that space, disconnected from the outside world. At first, it felt liberating, like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself wanting to know more about him, about the pain he was so clearly running from. One rainy evening, after yet another fight with my fiancé, I found myself at the apartment again. Daniel was waiting for me, as he always was, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He pulled me to him, his lips crashing against mine with a force that left me breathless. This time there was no hesitation, no restraint. He lifted me onto the windowsill, the rain streaming down the glass as our bodies collided, the world outside forgotten. His hands gripped my thighs, his movements unrelenting, as though he was trying to prove something to himself, to me, or to the ghosts that haunted him. I wrapped my arms around his neck, holding him close, feeling the weight of his emotions in every touch. The sound of the rain mixed with our breaths, creating a rhythm that felt almost primal. Daniel's breath was ragged as he pulled me closer, his hands leading up my sides, with a desperate intensity that mirrored the storm outside. The rain pounded against the glass, a relentless rhythm that seemed to match the wild beating of my heart. His lips moved from my mouth to my neck, his kisses hot and urgent, leaving a trail of fire in the wake. I tilted my head back, surrendering to the overwhelming sensation of his touch, my fingers digging into his shoulders as I clung to him. He lifted me effortlessly, carrying me to the center of the room, where the faint glow of a street lamp illuminated our tangled bodies. His movements were raw, almost animalistic, but there was a tenderness beneath the surface, a need to connect, to feel something real in the midst of all the chaos. I responded in kind, my hands exploring every inch of him, memorizing the contours of his body as though this moment could last forever. The air between us was thick with heat and longing, the space around us shrinking until there was nothing left but the two of us. As we reached the peak of our passion, the tension dissolved into a quiet stillness, our breaths mingling in the humid air. Daniel rested his forehead against mine, his eyes searching mine for something unspoken. I held his gaze, feeling a surge of emotion I couldn't quite name, as though I was both lost and found in the same instant. The rain continued to fall outside, its steady rhythm grounding us as we lay together, tangled and breathless, in a fleeting moment of connection that felt as fragile as it was powerful. He said nothing, and I didn't ask. I knew better by now. But as I pulled away, his eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them. Something fragile, something human. It was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to keep me coming back. Daniel and I were two broken people clinging to each other in a space that wasn't ours. He was running from something, just as I was, and for a while it felt like enough. But the more I gave of myself, the more I realized he could never truly give anything in return. Our connection was intense, consuming, but it was also fleeting. A last dance before the music stopped. In the end, it wasn't sustainable. He disappeared one day, leaving nothing behind but the memory of his touch and the echoes of his pain. I returned to my life, to my fiancé, to the future I had been avoiding. But I was different now, changed by my time with him. Daniel had shown me a part of myself I hadn't known existed, and for that, I would always be grateful. Even now, I sometimes find myself thinking of that empty apartment, of the man who shared it with me for a brief, intense moment in time. And though it ended, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because in those fleeting days, I learned what it meant to feel truly alive.